Hi, thanks for being here. I'm the traveling stitcher over on Instagram, Magnolia Nest Designs here on Flosstube and Etsy, and a huge welcome to each of you, especially my subscribers. Thank you so much for inspiring me to keep making videos. I'm filming this on 23 January 2024. It's my third Flosstube episode and my first regular one, which doesn't feel very regular to me, and is both exciting and daunting to be honest. It's been just over 2 weeks since I filmed my whip parade, so today I'll be sharing with you what I've been stitching in that time. I'll have most of the regular segments from Flosstube videos, but also a couple of extras that I've been dreaming up just for you. So today's program of events will talk about whips, finishes, stitching plans, haul, Cross Stitch Academy, which today will be my tips for stitching sampler borders, Reading Nook, Multi-Crafting Corner, and Words of Wisdom. So, whips. This month, my stitching has a winter theme. I live in the tropics, 30 degrees today, Celsius. But I've been seeing so many pictures of winter from my Northern Hemisphere friends, and so I've decided to stitch winter in solidarity with you all, especially because when I return to New Zealand I will have seasons again and I don't have any winter pieces. I'd quite like to have a couple done before I go back. So this month the first one that I have done is Winter Cometh by Summerhouse Stitchworks. This was my New Year, New Start. Now if I can figure out how, I'll put pictures here of what the design has been charted to look like. What I had done when you saw it in my whip parade, if you watched that video, was about this many of these duck egg blue flying geese. I'm sure you can imagine that very easily. So this is 3 hours of stitching from that point. I'm stitching this on 18 count opalescent Aida. I'm not sure, I think you might be able to see the sheen there. It's so shiny and magical. I love it. I want to use this fabric but in a different color for a winter solstice piece that I've seen recently and am absolutely in love with. So I'm going to be researching how to dye fabric. But yes, 1/1 18 count opalescent Aida, using the called for Delicious DMC. My second whip that I've been working on is Dreaming Girl by Barbara Anna. This is a design you'll be very familiar with, and again, if I can, I'll put up pictures of how it's supposed to look and how it looked last time you saw it. This was my New Year, New Start last year, and I would have really liked to finish it last year, but I was working on other projects that had my attention, and so I'm making good progress on her now. She's showing a bit more saturated in the camera than she really is. This is a teal, not a deep blue, but I absolutely love her. So I'm stitching her as charted, except I've changed the neckline to be a V-shaped. In this stitching session, I have completed the under here color, and I've extended out the top color. Now this is the only color I've changed so far, and it's probably going to be the only color that I do change. I've done this side too. I'm using DMC 347, and I've also added this little flower here. What I had hoped was to stitch in the winter scene here, but I discovered when I started stitching that I should add more of the hair first so that I can place it more easily. I don't want to make a mistake because I've counted over too far. So 32 count Laguna, the color is Azure Blue, which is a Zweigart. I really love her. I hope you like her too. Oh, this is a tiny start. This was a start just a couple of days ago. This is Snowy Pines by Little House Needleworks. This is one I've wanted to stitch for years and years and years, but I have this thing about putting lots of time on my really big projects, which means not wanting to spend all my time on smalls. Obviously Christmas was a bit of an exception to that last year, but even then there's so many Christmas smalls that I just haven't allowed myself to start. And this year I'm going, if I really want to stitch it, I'm just going to stitch it, and if I have a lot of whips as a result, I'll worry about that at the end of the year. So I'm stitching this on 14 count coffee tea dyed Ada, which I did myself using the Priscilla and Chelsea method. I'm using the Called for Delicious DMCs, and this is a new start. Next up, this is not a winter piece, but this is one that I'm hoping to do some work on every month this year. Da-da-dum! Shores of Hawk Run Hollow. I adore this piece. I talked about it at length in my whip parade, and I'm not going to go into all of the details here, but I'm stitching this as a heirloom piece for my family, focusing on men in our family who were lost at sea. I was originally going to include a good friend of mine who was lost at sea, but I decided last night that I'm going to stitch a small companion piece for him, so that this will retain its relevance for future generations, and so I can have him included in my home. So this is where I'm at now. I am changing this significantly from what is called for, I suppose you'd say. It's designed as a 3x4 grid. I'm stitching 3x3 instead, so missing 3 of the blocks, but I'm changing up the way I do it. So this block here, which I've just finished last night, I'm so excited about it. Please focus, block. I've been stitching this block, it feels like forever. I stitched that enormous whale while I was flying over the Pacific Ocean, which felt really special. So this was 2 blocks in the original design. I have combined them together because I loved the animals and I loved the whale, and I did not love the great big huge seaweed because all I could think about was a body getting tangled up in it, and I didn't want to be thinking of that every time I saw this piece. So I've kept the coral. Apologies if I gave anyone visuals. I've added the words whales sing for these, so I'm charting my own words that will go in this piece to add a meaning and sentiment to me. This block here, I haven't done any progress on this yet. I'm debating, do I finish this block, and I finished the charting for the words last night, or do I move to this one here, which is going to be very stitch heavy? This is the great big huge blue brick house. I don't know. I want to start this one, but I feel like I should finish this one, and I think that's the rub right now. But the reality is this one has a lot of full coverage fill in that I sense might get tiresome at some point. And so if I start it now and then I have this as a quick finish that I can come to later, that might be the way to go. We'll see. I'll show you next time where I land, if I stitch any more on it at all. So I'm using 18 count Vintage Country Mocha, mostly 2x1, but 2/1, but 1/1 in some places. This background here is 1/1. That was the first time I'd ever stitched 1/1 on 18 count. I had thought previously that I would not be satisfied with the coverage because I like not seeing the background through my stitching, but the combination between this being a light darky blue color and the brown of the background, I'm really happy with the coverage, and it was so much more fun to stitch than these ones, which now look a bit squished to me. Good reason, in my opinion, why for me personally I don't want to have too many whips at a time, because my tastes and styles will evolve and change over the years, and I don't want to be stuck finishing something that's no longer the way I love to stitch. But for this one, what I've decided to do after consulting with the Instagram community, and thank you so much to everyone who weighed in, I've decided to continue doing it with 2 strands, not start over, but mix in 1 strand, where just one strand instead of 2, where it seems like it would work well for the piece. Yeah, so that's that one. Next up is finishes, and I have a very exciting finish to share with you. I think I started this piece in 2009. It was my oldest whip until a couple of days ago. I talked about this one at length in my whip parade as well. This whip, if I got the timing correct, would have turned 15 this year, and I'll talk a bit more in plans about the way I'm stitching, but I've been focusing on this a lot and I can't get it all in camera at the same time, but it's done. It's meant to be super wide, but it suited me better to make it smaller, and I absolutely love it this size. I haven't included the parts of the design that I fell slightly out of love with, and I've just included these beautiful birch trees. I love birch trees in the snow, which I also adore, perhaps because I don't live in it, so to me it's magical, and it doesn't last for months and freeze and make cars dangerous and all that, which I know that those of you who live in really cold climates have to deal with and fall out of love with. To me it's just magic, and I love it. And yeah, I put the final stitch in on this just a couple of days ago, and what was left to do when I pulled this out, I think the start of December, I added a row, so 10 stitches across all the way down. Had not been done except for like 1 or 2 stitches here and there, so I extended it out to complete those stitches and make them make sense in the body of the work. And a lot of this section here hadn't been done, so I will put up a picture if I can of where you saw it last, which had a huge amount of progress from when I pulled it out late last year, and it's finished. I'm so overjoyed with it. I can't wait to have it on my wall. And I just, yeah, to me the story of this piece, what I've learned from this piece is that if at any point you fall out of love with what you're stitching, put it away and stop stitching on it. That's what I did with this. And when you're ready to come back to it, be open to stitching it in a different way. When I put it away, I was despairing, thinking there's no way I can ever finish it because I'm not in love with it anymore. What am I going to do? And I felt terrible about it. And when I came back to it, I thought I can just finish what I've got, and that will be enough. And now I adore it so much. I don't want to fold it up and put it away. The sad thing about being done with it, I never thought I'd be sad to be done with it, but the sad thing is I won't be looking at it for hours in the evening anymore. Perhaps that will change when it's hanging on my wall, but for now it's finished, and I'm absolutely thrilled. I might leave this out while I talk plans. So plans for 2024, other than Mania and March Madness, I'm planning to stitch on 7 projects a month. I did that last year and I loved it. For me, that's a good number to stitch each month. I've got enough variety, so each day I can stitch whatever I want and feel really happy with my options and my choices. But it's constrained enough that I don't get decision fatigue, and that at the end of the month I feel like I have really good progress on each of those projects. So if I choose a project, my rule for this year is I need to stitch on it for at least 3 evenings that month. That might be just an hour, it might be just a thread, it's whatever that evening looks like for me. And it might be that I stitch on it for say 20 minutes and then I move to another piece. That's fine, but it gets 3 sessions however long they are. And I've stitched on 5 projects this month, so I'm allowed to add 2 more. Now, because I worked so hard on whipping down at the end of last year to just 12 whips from a peak of over 30, I'm allowing myself to have 2 new starts. And that's partially because I am wanting to stitch winter again next month. And the only winter whips I have, this was one, it's not a whip anymore. The only winter whips I have are the ones that I've just showed you that I've worked on this month. So I'm giving myself some variety, and if at the end of the month I decide I'm ready for some of these pieces to be rotated out for a little bit, that's okay too. You'll probably see a lot of these projects again next month, but we'll see. The 2 which I'm going to start are Penguin Love by Crochet GoGo and Winter Comes by Heartstring Samplery, and I'm absolutely pumped about both of them, so I can't wait to share them with you. The other thing that I'm doing for my plans this year is to have a focus piece that I put a lot of time and energy into each month, and that is going to be a large, generally full coverage piece. I'm hoping my focus pieces throughout will be my oldest whip, Next up is Emerald Tie Bicker. That whip also turns 15 this year. I would love to finish it this year. But when I say generally my oldest whip, it's because I'm holding space for me, because some of my older whips are enormous full coverages, and there will come a time when I just don't want to stitch on that called for design, or when another one which is newer is screaming to me, or when I want to start something new. And so I'm allowing myself to change my focus piece as the year progresses, but I have that intention of trying to clear out some of the older whips, particularly things that are a decade and a half old. I mean, they're ready. They can be on my wall now. You can see my back. So this one, I've jumped around all over the place. I just couldn't be bothered trying to tie off all over at the show. There's so many different colors in here. There's so many more than I think is visible either in the camera or in the naked eye, and so it didn't make sense to me to be trying not to travel very far. If I made that a focus, it would not be done, may not ever be done. So that was what worked for me at the moment, and I'm comfortable with that. All right, haul. So I've told you before, I am a stitcher on a budget, and so that's partially why I'm including a haul section, because I don't have the size haul that I often see on Flosstube, and I think that's okay. So I treated myself to a whole lot of delicious DMC. So because I live in the Pacific, I don't have access to stores which sell any craft supplies whatsoever, and what I did was I made a list at the start of the year of 24 projects that I would ideally like to start this year, and then I went through my DMC and I identified what threads I would need to purchase in order to stitch them, and these are those threads plus a couple of variegated DMC skeins that were not called for in those charts, but I thought those could be fun to design something with. Not altogether, that looks only slightly terrible. Maybe it would work. I don't know, but yeah, I'm really excited by this. So much possibility in this pile, and yeah, so nice to treat myself. Next up is the Cross Stitch Academy. So for those who are new here, the Cross Stitch Academy was co-hosted by Vonna Pfeiffer and I on Instagram last year. Its purpose is to share knowledge cyclically, because we've both been stitching for many years and like giving back to the community and learning from it. So we've wrapped that up last year, but I had a lot of requests at the time to kind of like show the episodes on YouTube, and I didn't have a way to do that then. I didn't start making Flosstube until just before Christmas, and so I'm picking it back up now, but not on Instagram, on Flosstube. So I want to be very clear at the outset. The purpose of the Academy is absolutely not to suggest I know everything, or that my way is the only way or the best way. It isn't. The way I stitch is best for me now. But after more than 3 decades cross-stitching, I can tell you my methods are still evolving. And what's best for me now may not be what's best for me next week. And what's best for me may not ever be what's best for you. So, please feel free to take anything that you like from it, but I hope you can understand my intent. Also, what we had hoped for in the Academy is for a conversation. So if you have any tips related to this topic, please share them in the comments so that we can all learn from each other. I'd absolutely love that. So with thanks to the Instagram community for choosing today's topic, it is my tips for stitching sampler borders. I have 2 tips to share with you today. The first one is for straight borders, and I talked about this in my whip parade. It is to do half stitches, because then if you make a mistake, they're really easy and fast to rip out compared to how they would be if they were full stitches. Also, you can count so easily. You can see 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 92. Just like that. I know that's the right length. That's partially because I counted these like so many times as I did each 10. But they're so much easier than it would be otherwise. You don't need to use counting pins, which I've tried once or twice and just dabbed myself. And I find it quite fun. I was super excited. Gosh, you could have bowled me over with a feather yesterday when I watched Jen from Quirks and Stitches Epic Work Parade with her mum, who's Leeskin on Instagram, and she said that she'd recently heard of this technique and tried it out on the video. I don't know if I was behind her hearing about it, either directly or through a chain of people, but it made me so excited to see how well it worked for her too, especially because I hadn't seen people doing this before. So I'm all about ideas being shared far and wide, and if this is something that you think you might like to try out and you do, please let me know, because I would love to hear how it works for you. And if you haven't watched their video, you should. It's amazing. It has one of the biggest whip parades I've ever seen, and they're just generally hilarious. So, second tip is for the borders which are not straight. And instead of talking you through it, I'm going to show you how I do it, and I'm going to do it using fabric for a sampler I'm about to start. Now, for those borders which aren't straight, I stitch an outline in a contrasting color in a cheap thread. I don't use embroidery thread, I use sewing thread, to mark the outer box, so I have something to constantly check in on. And by outer box, I mean the line around the outside of the chart. There's two ways to do this, and the one I use depends on the complexity of the border. The simplest approach is simply to long stitch a great big huge line, stitch the border against that line. So if I stitch a line on the right hand side of the fabric, then I'd stitch the right hand border, rip it out, stitch a line on the bottom, stitch the bottom border, rip it out, meaning, excuse me, rip out the marking line, don't rip out your border, and then rinse and repeat. I do that if it's a fairly dense border, where it's quite easy to see if you get off as you go, or any mistakes that you might make. The more complex approach takes longer, but it can pay dividends in keeping the abominable amphibian, whose name shall not be mentioned, away. Rather than just tell you about it, I'm going to do it with you now, because I feel like that will be a lot easier for you to understand than if I was trying to use my words. So I'll be preparing the fabric with you for Winter Comes by Heartstring Sampler. I've already cut it to the right side and edged it. If you'd like to hear how I did that, let me know. We'll cover it in a future episode, but for now we're going to focus on stitching the border. So immediately after cutting the fabric, the very first thing I do is either begin this process or write a note saying exactly what my margin size is, and that's because the margin I use varies from project to project. If you know, you always infallibly, no matter what, have, for instance, a 3-inch margin, then you don't need to do that, but if, like me, it changes, I find it really helpful to be reminded when I'm putting my first stitch in where it should go. I then immediately mark the top of the sampler. If it isn't square, that's especially important, so you don't accidentally stitch it in the wrong orientation and run out of room to stitch your sampler. But even if it's square, it's important because the grid lines I mark may differ from the top to the bottom. So this time I'm going to mark it for the purpose of filming with you today, just with this pin. My quilting pin will be on the top, but when I finish filming, I'll do a little X or a little mark up the top here so that I can see that. Even though I know that I generally start in about the same place and I could work it out, I don't want to finish the border and then don't know which is the top and which is the bottom, because sometimes things look symmetrical but they're not completely symmetrical, so it's better to be safe than sorry. I also, when I cut my fabric, I mark the corner that I cut in the center. So in the case of this piece of fabric, and I apologize I can't get it all in the camera, this side here and this side here were pre-cut and they weren't cut quite perfectly. One of the corners, I think it might be this one, you can see that it goes out a little bit. It hasn't been cut quite along the grid. And so if I use this as the corner that I measure in from, my piece will not be completely perfectly centered. So I cut this line myself and I cut that line myself, so I know that this is a right angle corner, and so I'm going to use this corner for placing my piece. Now, first thing I'm going to do is put my needle in. So I have a 2-inch margin on this one, so I'm putting my needle in a long way away from that, and that is so that the waist knot is a long way away from the stitches that I'm going to put in. I don't want my threads getting caught on it. So then I'm going to go to the back of the fabric to make this easy for myself, because 2 inches on the back should be the same as 2 inches on the front, and I'm just going to place my quilting ruler. I was a professional quilter for quite some time. I'll place my quilting ruler on here. I know a lot of people have proper corner gauges for cross stitch, which work exactly the same way. Make certain that I am going in a hole, which I was, and pull my thread through. So this here, where my needle has gone up, is the corner, the very, very corner of my project. Now, I'm going to set this aside and I'm going to talk to you about something slightly different, which determines where I place my next stitch. So some designers chart their designs to the border of the grid. And by that I mean, let me pull out a chart and show you. Please excuse my filthy finger marks. So for some designers, so by edge of the chart, I mean this line here, the far border of the chart. For some designers, their stitches will go all the way to that line in some place. So that is the true edge of the chart. For others, it will be 1 stitch in. For others, it might be 2, it might be 3 stitches in. I've seen 3 stitches in is where some people start, and there's nothing wrong with that. What I like to do is I like to identify whether the stitches go all the way to the edge or whether they are slightly in. And I looked at this chart and I learned from it that these stitches started one row in, and so I've marked that off on my chart. And when I stitch this border frame that I'm doing now, I'm going to do it along this blue line. I'm not going to do it along the line that they had on the outside of their chart, and that's because I could probably only say this to a stitcher, crocheter or knitter without people thinking I'm absolutely unintelligent, but counting is hard. It's really hard, and for me, the more I have to count, the more invitations I'm giving to the abominable amphibian to come and join me. I don't want him to join me. He's not welcome in my home. So if I mark this and I put my framing grid here on this blue line, then when I'm counting to this, I'm only counting out 1, 2. I'm not counting out 3. And there'll be places where I might be counting in 10. If I'm counting in 9 instead of counting 10, I'm simply more likely to get it right. So that is the first step for me. But then I'm going to mark, and again, this is the more complex method, but I'm going to mark all of these thicker grid lines on my piece, and they usually denote a 10 stitch gap. And the reason I'm going to mark them is because those are fixed points that I can count off. I could be counting off a berry or a leaf or a stick or a flower or whatever happens to be in the border, but I might have stitched that in the wrong place. So I might be perpetuating a problem. If I'm counting off something that's completely fixed, then I'm far less likely to get into strife. Part of the reason I mention that is because I am doing it to these thick lines in the pattern. So when my chart comes 1 stitch further than my line does, it means this first grid, and I'm not going to go across because I don't want to show you any more of the pattern. I feel like this is okay because no one could possibly replicate anything from seeing this. But that's really my limit. Sorry. So because I'm stitching 1 in, if I count across to 10, which it normally would be, then it will be off all the way. And my lines that I'm stitching here will not match with the pattern. So what I have to do is, because this is in 1, my first line across that I'm going to stitch is going to be 9. If this was in 2, my first row line that I would stitch would be 8, so that I'm always getting to and keeping to that these grid lines here. I hope that made sense. So I'm going to show you what I'm talking about here, and I'm going to count this probably only once or twice for instructional purposes, but I will go back and count it many times. And when I'm doing it, I'll count it at least 4 times because I don't want to make a mistake here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 is my first one. Now with my needle, I'm going up 2, down 1, that gap, and then back in at the bottom. This would be a lot easier to show you if I hadn't picked one on a black fabric. But this happens to be the sampler I'm going to start tonight. And so this is my first one, which is 9 across, because remember I moved the border in 1. The next one will be 10. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I do the same thing. Up 2, down 1, all right, and I'll do just one more while I'm with you. I'm gonna count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now what I am noticing is that my nail color and this fabric do not seem to be compatible. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to remove it before I go any further. But I think this is enough. This is enough to show you what I'm talking about. So eventually this will be all the way around my fabric, and you can see how quick that is to do. I will take a little bit longer over it and count it a few more times, but it will take me less than half an hour to do the frame for this entire piece, and that can save me so many hours in areas that for me personally that time is worth it. Now a couple of things that I'd like to point out here, and I'm moving this a lot because I'm trying to get it in focus. I think that's in. All right. So this line I am deliberately doing on the top of the fabric, and that's for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's the line I want to count to, so I want it to be visible. Number 2, I don't want to split this thread by putting my thread through it when I'm stitching. If I do, it doesn't matter. This is a cheap thread. I'm going to cut it, I'm going to rip it out, but it's just extra effort to pull it out when there's stitches through it than it is if you haven't accidentally pierced it with your needle. By having it on the front, that's going to save me some of that time. So I'll show you on the back so you can only see these little markers here. The other thing is these little markers are the things that I'll count to, and I've got them on the outside so that they won't ever be disfigured or covered by my stitches that I'm going to put in there. So when I'm done, when I have done the whole thing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this thread or a ruler, and I'm going to go, all right, I'm aligning you perfectly with here. I'm coming along and I'm following with my eyes, making sure that I'm following the holes, whether it's Ada like this, which is easier, or Lugana, linen, or whatever you're stitching on. I make sure this line here matches perfectly with the line on the other side, which means I know with certainty that my border is perfectly placed. Oh, sorry, my frame for the border is perfectly placed, and so my border is far more likely to be the same. I find that especially useful for more complex borders, and I'll put up a picture here if I can of what Winter Comes looks like. as you will hopefully be able to see, there are places where you have to count in a really long way. And also what you might not notice so clearly from the picture but is visible on the chart is there's very few places where the stitches actually touch this outer edge. More often it's one stitch in, and so I feel like that makes it even more risky to make a mistake. And I think it looks really beautiful for it, but I want to stitch it once. I don't want to have to stitch 3 or 4 or 5 leaves just to get one because I made a counting error. So these are my tips. That's what works for me. I'd love to hear what you think of it, and if you have anything that you would like to share, please do. As I say, this chart, so it's written as being 189 by 189, but when I count it, there's 1 and 1 in, so it's 187 by 187. Probably even with my double, triple counting and the measuring with my line, it'll probably still only take me about half an hour to do this whole thing. So that's why it's worth it for me. If I was trying to grid the inside of the whole piece like people sometimes do for full coverage, I don't know that I'd bother with a sampler. So this is my happy medium. All right, next section is reading nook. So I am an avid reader. I've read 7 books this year, and yes, I know that's a bit nuts. My friends have been ribbing me about it. 2 of them have been audiobooks and the rest have been physical, and I'd like to share 2 5-star reads with you today. Now this one I was in 2 minds of sharing because part of me wanted to gatekeep. Dick King-Smith is one of my favorite children's authors, so if you have children in your life in any capacity and you have access to his books, please consider sharing them with them. In New Zealand, I think he's out of print, but certainly even our libraries don't carry them anymore. Secondhand shops rarely have them, new bookshops never do. So he's hard to find, but if you can, there's illustrations. It's great for probably up to age 11, but I'm a lot older than that and still read and love his books. And this story, it's short, it's early reader, but he's like C.S. Lewis in that he doesn't dumb himself down. Like, he uses words like temptation, tender, delicious, dislikes, that are not super early reader, but the story itself would I think resonate with a lot of different ages. And it's a great story. This is about a cat who is the son and sibling of dedicated mouse catchers who doesn't want to eat mice, and he wants to be friends with mice, and so he catches a mouse and he keeps them as a pet and keeps its babies as a pet. And then he discovers that actually keeping pets can sometimes not be very nice for the pet itself. Sometimes they want freedom, and so he finds a way to coexist with his pets in a way that he cares for them and loves them and looks after them, and they have freedom. And it's a happy, feel-good story which I loved, and I think other people might enjoy as well, especially if you like children's literature, which I unashamedly do. The other one, my other 5-star read that I'll share with you, is a lot longer. This is 963 pages. And I didn't just check that, I remembered because I kept looking at it and going, that's a lot of pages. Dragonfly and Amber by Diana Gabaldon. This is the sequel to Outlander, which is originally published in the UK under the name Cross Stitch. When I saw that, I knew I had to read. I actually took an Outlander tour in Scotland last year, and everyone was obsessed, absolutely obsessed, with the movies and the books who was on the tour. I just went for learning about the history of the country. And they converted me, and so I loved this book. I laughed, I cried, I wanted it to be 100 pages longer. Fortunately, there are many more books in the series for me to read. And something that I did over the Christmas break is I started painting the edges of my books. I don't know if you can really tell, but this is metallic gold, which is so much fun when I was reading it, and that's partially why, between that and the book, I read it in, I think, 5 days, because I just just one more page, one more page. But if you like historical fiction, you might want to consider this book. There should be a lot of trigger warnings. There's a lot of like murder, and it includes atrocities from the English against the Scottish people, and that can be uncomfortable reading, but it's still a fantastic story, and I really, really enjoyed it and can recommend it. 2 more sections to go. One is multi-crafting corner, and I'm sharing this partially to encourage myself to keep working on crafts that are not cross-stitch, because they can tend to fall out in my life because I just want to stitch. But this is a crochet blanket that I'm knitting. Excuse me, where did that come from? This is a throw blanket that I am crocheting, and I'm doing it in the waffle shape, which I love and is quite pricey to purchase as blankets. And it's actually just 2 really, really, really simple stitches on repeat, plus the chain on. So I'm really enjoying this. It's going to be 3 color blocked bands. This one, which is a light aqua, a cream, and then a sage green. And I'm hoping that when I come back I'll have either more progress on this to share with you, or progress on something else. My final section is words of wisdom. I wish I had genuine personal words of wisdom to close out with, like Jane always does at the end of her and Julie's Flosstube videos. They are running with scissors and are hands down one of my favorites. They're an absolute hoot. I don't. But I often read quotes that inspire me and that I ponder on while I stitch. So I'd like to close out this episode by sharing with you a quote which struck me during the past couple of weeks. It's by Abraham Lincoln, and it is, "We can complain because rose bushes have thorns, or we can rejoice because thorn bushes have roses." I think that's so beautiful. I don't know why it found me. It might be because I've just read Eckhart. I don't know. But I find that concept just really gorgeous. And I wanted to leave it with you this week. If you enjoyed this episode, please join my community of amazing Stitchy subscribers, and give the video a thumbs up, which I'm told will help it reach like-minded people. There's not much I love more than sharing the joy of stitching with people, and I'm really grateful that I was able to share it with you today. If you like more regular updates, I'm on Instagram as The Traveling Stitcher. I will put the link in the description and try and also link to the projects that I have shared with you today. I haven't been able to figure out how to do that yet, but hopefully some trusty Googling will do the trick. But anyway, that's all for now. Thank you so much for being here. Ka kite ano. See you next time.